This week's topic is Observing Learning and Teaching in the Second Language Classroom. It is based on Chapter 5 in our textbook, How Languages Are Learned by Lightbound and Spada. Let us first talk about the settings in which observing of learning and teaching can take place. A second language can be learned in one of two ways. It can be acquired naturally from contact with native speakers in society, or it can be learned formally in a classroom setting. Our textbook limits the options to these two and then further divides classroom instruction into two, so that we get the following three settings. 1. Natural acquisition. 2. Structure-based instructional learning. And 3. Communicative instructional learning. There is, however, another distinction to be made, and that is between second language classroom instruction on the one hand and foreign language classroom instruction on the other hand. Although some of the distinctions between these two types of instructional settings are admittedly minor, they are not devoid of importance. The most important difference between these two settings is that second language classroom learning often takes place in the country where that second language is the majority language. Thus, ESL classes in the United States are clearly an example of this type of instruction. Such classes tend to be geared towards immigrants who have clear integrative and instrumental motivation to learn the language in order to function in that society. Foreign language classroom instruction takes place abroad, that is to say, outside the country or location where that language is widely spoken. If you learn Spanish, French, or German in the United States, you are engaging in this type of classroom instruction because those languages are not the majority languages here. Thus, when you leave the classroom, you do not have a lot of exposure to the foreign language, necessarily. However, this distinction should also not be taken too rigidly. Sometimes, for historical or political reasons, what I have termed a foreign language may well have sizable communities of speakers even in the country where that language may be said to be non-native. Spanish is an excellent example, as the United States has a large minority population of Spanish speakers, and so it is not impossible to leave the classroom and find a Spanish-speaking community in which to engage a naturalistic language acquisition. 100 years ago, German, Swedish, and Norwegian would have been in similar positions in Minnesota and Wisconsin, as there were still large communities where these languages were spoken. They have now disappeared, as the communities have all adopted English, with very few exceptions. Our textbook describes the differences between the three main types of language learning, and the point they make is clearly that naturalistic language acquisition is the best type. Our authors Lightbound and Spada describe the following features. The learner is exposed to the language outside the classroom, at work, at school, or in social interaction. There is little error correction. There is exposure to much and varied input, and learners participate in many different types of communication. The importance of exposure to much and varied input cannot be exaggerated. It is this characteristic that makes naturalistic acquisition the most attractive in light of the language acquisition theories we have looked at so far. It provides for the most repetition and reinforcement, ensuring optimal communication and opportunities for the learner to enlarge his linguistic repertoire, and also has the fewest societal hindrances to learning. Think of peer pressure, cultural taboos, shyness, etc. Now, classroom instruction is described in terms of two main approaches, structure-based and communicative instruction. The textbook is quite openly hostile to the former type. It is described as boring and deficient. Here are the features of structure-based instruction. Linguistic items are presented one at a time in increasing complexity. Errors are frequently corrected. Exposure to the language is very restricted, a few hours a week. Learners are exposed to a limited range of discourse types, and the use of native language for classroom management issues. The description of communicative instruction is much more positive. Contextual clues are used to make even more complex input comprehensible. Meaning is emphasized over form. Little explicit error correction, but clarification requests provide feedback. Limited exposure to native language input, but greater exposure to peer interlanguage input. and a variety of discourse types. The reasoning is that optimal language instruction should attempt to mimic the features of naturalistic language acquisition as much as possible. Much and varied input, and an emphasis on communication rather than correctness or accuracy. This approach has given rise to the target language-only approach in many foreign language classrooms. Only the instructed language is used in class in an attempt to recreate the much and varied input of naturalistic language learning. It is clear that communicative instruction is, on the whole, better than structure-based instruction, but I feel I have to put the criticism of structure-based instruction in the proper context. One important caveat to the promotion of target language-only communicative approaches is that it can only be successful if students are exposed to massive amounts of input. Otherwise, the much and varied factor is not met. On most American college campuses, this factor simply is not met unless the language programming integrates a substantial year abroad component into their curriculum, or if the program is taught as an immersion or intensive course, multiple weeks with daily classes of at least 2 to 3 hours. Ask your fellow students on our campus for the main factor of their success in Spanish. They went to Spain, or Latin America, or some other Spanish-speaking country for a semester or a year, and what they learned there was more helpful than 4 or 5 semesters of classroom work at Bethel. That is the experience of most students. And of course, there are opportunities to speak with proficient speakers of Spanish in the Twin Cities. Think of Union Gospel Mission, and even on campus. Without such outside-of-the-classroom support, most communicative instructional programs tend to run the risk of producing students who have a largish vocabulary in many communicative situations, but are not able to use it in a sentence. Structure-based instruction has its place in view of the drawbacks of communicative instruction, given that many American colleges cannot provide the much and varied input required for successful communicative teaching. A focus on accuracy of fewer grammatical and semantic items may well have great advantages. Structure-based instruction also does not need to be completely devoid of communicative application. In short, the black-and-white picture of the textbook is a little more nuanced. These types of learning settings are not strictly separated. Classroom learners may well continue to learn in naturalistic settings after school. Teachers often combine and vary approaches, some structure-based tasks and some communicative tasks. Not all schools, programs, and learners have the same goals and needs for learning. Natural acquisition is best because it provides the richest exposure to the native language. That, at least, is paramount. Let us now talk about the observation research. A lot of the research on the topic of different teaching methods and acquisition environments depends on observation of teachers teaching. There are 2 main types of interaction that are studied. First, teacher-student interaction, and second, student-student interaction. In both settings, researchers are trying to figure out which teaching approaches work best to mimic naturalistic language acquisition and promote the most natural communicative use of language by the learners. In these exchanges, researchers take note of the following important factors: errors and feedback on errors, both from the teacher and other students, questions asked by the teacher, and those include genuine questions, where the information is actually requested, and so-called display questions. Those are questions that the teacher asks solely to give students an opportunity to rehearse a particular linguistic form. Then, negotiation of meaning and metalinguistic comments are also studied. That research in this area is moving forward can be illustrated by the discussion on genuine questions and display questions. The distinction between these 2 types of questions was drawn up under the assumption that display questions, if used too often, can stifle the language in the classroom. Students become demotivated by the artificial and repetitive nature of all these obvious questions. One study by Michael Long and Charlene Sato, 1983, indeed argued that teachers in ESL classes were using too many display questions, and thus distorting to students what natural language sounds like. But more recent studies have nuanced this view considerably. When used within a clearly delineated teaching goal, display questions can be used as a means to help students along in a discussion or activity, a technique called scaffolding. One final note about classroom observations. There is a completely different approach to classroom observations, and that is a so-called classroom ethnography. In such an approach, the observer records as many details as possible about one single classroom or a small group of classes. The study often takes place over a lengthy period of time. This is a type of qualitative study in which the researcher tries to analyze the internal dynamics of one particular teacher's approach to language teaching. This is the end of the lecture. Now there is an assignment. In preparation for next week, I want you to make the case for both structure-based and communicative instruction. Working in your team report groups, I want groups 1, 2, and 3 to write and post on Moodle a poster with a 100-word case in favor of structure-based teaching in the language classroom. What is good about it? Groups 4 and 5 will do the same assignment for communicative instruction. Each group should post one combined message, so designate one group member to upload the response. Please post this message as a single Word or PDF file using illustrations, color, and any other creative device you can think of. Please post this assignment no later than noon on Wednesday, so that everyone will have a chance to look at all the other groups' postings before class on Wednesday evening. Thank you so much for your cooperation. I hope to see you later.